The cake had been sitting on the table since 1 o'clock, and at 5:40 in the afternoon it was still whole. It was a 6-inch white cake from the bakery case at Vetter's Market, the kind with the shell border piped around the top edge and a spray of pale blue flowers in one corner. Verna Kessler had asked the girl behind the counter not to write anything on it. She'd said it twice, actually, because the girl was new and kept reaching for the bag of icing. No name, no number. Just the flowers, please. The candles were on the table next to it, still in their cardboard sleeve. A 9 and a 0. Vetter's had been out of 9s in the little boxed sets, so she'd bought the 0 from a set and the 9 loose from a torn packet by the register, and the two candles didn't match. The 9 was a slightly deeper blue than the 0. She had noticed that in the car, and decided it didn't matter. 4 cups were out on the green tablecloth, 4 saucers. She had counted them twice that morning. Dan, Claudia, if she flew in, Teddy, and herself, and then put out a 5th in case Dan brought June, and then taken the 5th one back down again, around 3, because it looked hopeful in a way she didn't like the look of. The coffee had gone cold in the percolator around 4. She'd unplugged it rather than let it scorch. Outside, the wind was coming off the fields north of town in long, unsteady pushes, and the 2 maples in her front yard were doing that thing they did in April in Michigan, holding their little red buds tight and refusing to commit. It had rained that morning hard for about 20 minutes. Now the sky had that scrubbed-out, rinsed look, and the light coming through the front window was the color of weak tea. Verna sat in the chair by the window with her hands in her lap. She was wearing the navy dress with the buttons up the front, the one she'd bought in 2016 for Alma Docherty's funeral and had worn maybe 6 times since. She'd pinned Walt's wren to the collar. It was a little enamel bird, no bigger than a thumbnail, brown and cream, with one black bead for an eye. He'd given it to her at Christmas in 1974 because she'd spent that whole fall pointing out a wren that nested in the porch light housing, and he had gotten sick of hearing about the wren and had bought her the pin instead of asking her to stop. The house made its sounds. The refrigerator cycled. The clock over the stove, the plain white one with the black hands, the one Walt had hung in 1968 and never once leveled properly, kept up its small, dry ticking. At 5:47 she got up, went to the kitchen, and checked that the ringer on the phone was turned up. It was. She checked it anyway, then set the phone face up on the counter where she'd see the screen light, and then, because she'd already gotten up, she opened the refrigerator and looked at the chicken salad she'd made at 11 that morning. She'd used the good celery. She'd put in the grapes, which Teddy liked and nobody else did, and which she had bought in a bag of 2 pounds, because that was the only size they had. She shut the door. Twice that afternoon, a car had come down Peel Street, and she had turned her head, and twice the car had gone on past, and both times she'd felt something small go up and then come back down in her chest, like a hand raised and then lowered. The second time she'd said out loud, to nobody, "That's the Nussbaum's boy," even though she had no idea whose car it was, and the Nussbaum's boy was 54 years old and lived in Traverse City. She was 90 years old that day, April 16th, 2026. She'd been born in a farmhouse outside Fremont at 4:15 in the morning, during a spring so cold her mother had kept her in a dresser drawer near the stove for the first 2 weeks. 90. She had been turning it over all day, the way you turn over a coin you find in a coat pocket. At 5:52, she cut herself a piece of the cake. She did it quickly, standing up with a good knife, and she made it a small slice, because a small slice looked less like giving up. She put it on one of the 4 saucers and stood at the counter and ate about half of it, and it was too sweet, the way store cake always was. And she thought, not for the first time, that she should have made a spice cake, that Walt's mother's spice cake recipe was in the drawer with the rubber bands, that she'd been perfectly capable of making it and had bought one instead, because buying one felt like less of a fuss. Then she put the rest of the slice in the trash under the sink and washed the saucer and dried it and put it back on the table with the other 3, and that was the moment, if anyone had been there to see it, when her face did something. It didn't last. She straightened the tablecloth where the corner had ridden up. She squared the candles next to the box. She sat back down. They had said something. That was the part she kept coming back to, like a tongue to a chipped tooth. In February, at the table, at Dan's house, over the pot roast, someone had said 90, and someone had said, we should do something, and Dan had said, we'll figure it out. And Claudia had said something about flights, and Teddy had been on his phone by the window and had said, yeah, count me in without looking up. We'll figure it out. She had not asked again. She had thought about asking in March, when Dan called about the gutters. She had gotten as far as the shape of the sentence in her mouth, and then had said instead that the downspout on the north side was fine, that Perry Nussbaum had looked at it. You did not ask people to remember you. That was the whole thing about being remembered. It only counted if it came unasked. At 6:03, the phone lit up on the counter, and she was up faster than she'd been up all day, and it was Vedder's Market, texting to tell her that her rewards points would expire on the last day of the month. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down and stood there with her hand flat on the counter. Maybe they're doing Saturday, she thought. That would make sense. Nobody wants to drive on a Thursday. Maybe Claudia's flight. Maybe I've got the day wrong, she thought. And she knew perfectly well she did not have the day wrong. She had never in her life had a day wrong. She had run a classroom for 40 years, on a wall calendar and a wristwatch, and had not once in all that time forgotten a fire drill, or a field trip, or a single child's birthday. Not one, not in 40 years. She used to write them on index cards in August, before she'd even met them. She went back to the front room. At 6:11, she picked up her book from the arm of the chair, a library copy of a novel about a lighthouse keeper, and she found the page and read the same paragraph 3 times. At 6:12, somebody knocked on her door. It was not a loud knock. 3 taps, evenly spaced, the kind of knock a person makes when they are not sure whether they should be there at all. She sat still for 1 full second with the book open on her knee. Then she closed it and set it down, and stood, and standing took her a moment now. It took a hand on the arm of the chair and a small internal negotiation with her left hip, which had been replaced in 2009 and had opinions about weather. The hallway to the front door was 11 feet. She had measured it once, years ago, for a runner she never bought. She turned the deadbolt. She opened the door. There was a man on her porch. He was a big man, 60-something, in a canvas jacket with the collar up, and his hair was white and cut close, and he was holding a coffee can wrapped in aluminum foil with a rubber band around it, and he had the raw, chapped look of a person who had been standing in the wind trying to work up to something. For about 3 seconds, Verna did not know him. That was the thing she would think about later, at 2 in the morning, lying in the dark. 3 whole seconds. She, who could look at a room of 30 children in September and have every name down by Thursday. Then the man said, "Mrs. Kessler," and his voice cracked right down the middle of it, and something in the way his jaw sat, the underbite, the way he held his shoulders up around his ears like he was expecting a door to close. "Hollis," she said. "Hollis Trombley." "Yes, ma'am." "You're—" She stopped. She looked past him. Behind Hollis Trombley, on her front walk, there was a woman in a red coat, holding a foil pan with both hands. Behind the woman in the red coat, on the 3 concrete steps and spilling out onto the grass, there were more people. A man with a cane, 2 women who were clearly sisters, both in their 60s, one of them crying already and laughing at herself for it. A tall black man in his 70s, in a good gray overcoat, holding something long and flat, wrapped in a bedsheet. A woman in scrubs, like she'd come straight off shift. A younger woman, younger, meaning 50, with a cardboard box balanced on her hip. And behind them, along the walk and out past the mailbox and down both sides of Peel Street, cars, parked nose to tail in front of the Nussbaums, in front of the empty Dietrich place, all the way down to the stop sign at 3rd. A Silverado with Wisconsin plates, a minivan with a Kalamazoo dealer frame, a dusty white sedan someone had backed carefully into the last gap. People were still getting out of them. Verna Kessler stood in her doorway in her navy dress with a dead man's enamel wren pinned to the collar, and the wind came up the porch steps and moved the hem of it, and she did not say anything at all, because she could not find the beginning of a sentence. Hollis Trombley shifted the coffee can to his left hand. "We heard you were turning 90, he said. Behind him somebody laughed, a wet, undone sort of laugh, and somebody else said, "Oh my God, look at her." And the woman in the red coat said, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Is there— where should I put the beans?" There were 40 of them. Not 38, not 42. 40. They would count, later, twice, because it became important to know. 40 people who had at one time or another sat in a 6th grade classroom at Renwick Elementary School in Alder Creek, Michigan, and been taught reading and English, and, as several of them would put it that night, in almost exactly the same words, without ever having compared notes, some other thing they didn't have a name for. The youngest of them was 39. The oldest was 79. Between them they had driven, that day, something in the neighborhood of 2,000 miles. And not one of them knew, not Hollis, not the woman with the beans, not any of them, that they were the only people who had come. To understand why 40 adults drove across 3 states on a cold Thursday in April to stand on the lawn of a woman most of them hadn't spoken to in 30 or 40 or 50 years, you have to go back to a hallway in Fremont, Michigan, in June of 1954, and a woman named Ada Lindqvist. Verna Hoekstra was 18 that June, the third of 5 children on a farm that ran 40 milking cows, and she was graduating from Fremont High School with the second best grades in a class of 61 and absolutely no plan. Her father's plan was that she would work at the canning plant in Hesperia and marry somebody. This was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. There were 5 children and 40 cows and a mortgage taken out in 1949, and the arithmetic said what it said. Miss Lindqvist had taught Verna 7th grade English in 1948. She was a narrow, upright, unbeautiful woman of about 55 with a bun that had gone the yellow-gray of old piano keys, and she had a reputation among the students for being cold, which was accurate, and among the parents for being difficult, which was also accurate, and among a very small number of former students for being the single most important person who had ever happened to them, which was a thing none of those students ever compared notes about either. On the last Friday of the school year, she caught Verna in the corridor outside the gymnasium and handed her a small box. Inside was a fountain pen, green marbled celluloid, an Esterbrook, a fine nib, the kind of pen a schoolteacher on a schoolteacher's salary bought for herself as a serious purchase. On the band of the cap, engraved in tiny letters, A.L. "That's mine," Miss Lindqvist said. "I've had it 11 years. Verna said something about not being able to accept it. "You've applied to Western," Miss Lindqvist said. It was not a question, and it also was not true. Verna had thought about applying to Western Michigan and had not done it, and had told exactly one person, a girl named Dolores, and apparently Dolores had talked. "I haven't," Verna said. "Then you will." They stood there. Somewhere behind them, a door banged, and a group of boys went past at a jog, and the corridor smelled like floor wax and wet wool and the chalk dust that lived permanently in the seams of that building. Miss Lindqvist said, "You'll be a teacher. You've got the eye for it." The eye for what? And here Miss Lindqvist said the thing that Verna Hoekstra, later Verna Kessler, would carry for 72 years, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, taking it out and turning it over so often that the edges wear down and it fits your hand exactly. "Notice one child a day," she said. "Just one. Then tell them what you noticed, not that they're good. What you noticed." She let go of the box. "Anybody can hand out praise. It's cheap and children know it." Then she said good luck and walked away down the corridor, and Verna never saw her again. Ada Lindqvist retired in 1959, moved to a sister's house in Ludington, and died in the spring of 1971. Verna found out about it 4 months late from a paragraph in a newspaper her mother had saved. She applied to Western Michigan that August. Her father did not speak to her for 11 days. And then one morning at the barn he said, "Your Uncle Sib has a room in Kalamazoo." And that was the apology and the blessing both. And neither of them ever mentioned it again. She graduated in June of 1958 with a bachelor's degree in English education and $140. And in September of that year, she stood in room 9 of Renwick Elementary School in Alder Creek, Michigan, in front of 29 sixth graders, 22 years old, sweating through the lining of a gray suit jacket she'd bought second-hand, and completely certain that she was going to be very, very good at this. She was not very good at it. Not at first. Room 9 was on the north end of the building, which meant the radiators clanked and never quite kept up, and the windows were tall and single-paned and rattled when the wind came off the fields. The floor was that dark oiled wood they used to put in schools, and it had a specific sound, a kind of soft hollow knock under a heel, and there was one board 6 feet from the door that squeaked in a rising two-note way, and 30 years later, a grown man in a firefighter's uniform would stand in a hallway of a completely different building and hear a floor make a sound like that and think of her without knowing why. That first year she was rigid. She had studied hard, and she believed sincerely that the job was the transmission of a body of material from one side of a room to the other, and that the obstacle to this transmission was disorder, and that the answer to disorder was consistency. So she was consistent. Papers were due on the day they were due. Margins were 1 inch. Penmanship was graded because penmanship was a discipline and discipline generalized, and she said so out loud more than once in a voice she had practiced. And in October of 1958 there was a boy named Bernard Ostrander. Bernie Ostrander was 11, small for it, with a cowlick that would not lie down, and a coat that was too big and had been his brother's. He sat in the 3rd row by the coat hooks. His handwriting was appalling, not sloppy exactly, shaky. The letters came out with a tremble in them, like a line drawn on a bus. She kept him in from recess for 5 days, running to practice his letters. He did not cry, and he did not argue. He sat at the desk in the 3rd row with the November light coming in, gray, through those tall windows, and he made rows of LLs and rows of ES, and every single one of them shook, and she stood at her desk grading and thought, he isn't trying. On the 6th day, the school secretary, a woman named Mrs. Pelkey, who had worked in that building since before the war, and who had a way of delivering information sideways, said to her in the office, the Ostranders had a bad summer. Verna said, I'm sorry. The father, said Mrs. Pelkey, and adjusted a stack of mimeograph paper, and said nothing else. And that was the entire conversation. Verna did not ask what about the father. She was 22, and she did not know how to ask. She stopped keeping Bernie in from recess. She never said why, and she never said sorry, and she never... This was the part that would come back to her in the dark decades later, at 81, at 88, at 3 in the morning with the clock ticking in the kitchen. She never told that boy that his handwriting was not the reason she'd been hard on him, or that she had been wrong, or that she had noticed, eventually, that his hand shook at other times too, when a door slammed, when a man's voice came loud down the hallway. Bernie Ostrander finished 6th grade with a C. He went on to 7th grade, and then, at some point, into the world. And Verna Kessler kept teaching, and the thing about a 40-year career is that it will hand you 1,100 children, and you will not get all of them right. But something in her changed after that fall. Not fast, not in a scene. By the spring of 1959, she had started doing a thing she did not have a name for and would never have called a method when she graded a paper in blue-black ink with Ada Lindqvist's pen. She wrote in the margin one specific thing she had noticed. Not good work, not nice job, not a smiley face. You put the storm at the end. That was the right place for it. You use short sentences when you're angry. Watch that. It's a weapon. 3rd paragraph. You finally stopped explaining and just told me. Do that first, next time. This is the only paper in the class that mentions the smell of anything. It took her twice as long to grade. She did it anyway, and she went on doing it, 29 papers at a time. 4 sections a day in the middle years, for 40 years, at the kitchen table after supper, with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and the pen scratching along in that dry, fast, whispering way a fine nib has on cheap school paper, scritch, scritch, scritch. Her children grew up falling asleep to that sound coming up through the floor. She met Verna Kessler in the spring of 1959 at a pancake supper at the Methodist Church, where he was carrying a coffee urn and she was refilling a creamer, and he told her, apropos of nothing, that the church bulletin had a typo in it, and it had been bothering him all week. He was a printer. He set type at the Alder Creek Register 4 nights a week on the linotype, and he had ink in the creases of his knuckles that never entirely came out, not in 52 years, not even at the end. He was a quiet man with a dry, delayed sense of humor. He would come back with a joke 2 full minutes after the moment had passed, and it would be better for the wait. They married in June of 1959 at the Methodist Church, and they bought the house on Peel Street in 1960 for $11,400, a white 2-story with a porch across the front, 2 maples, a detached garage with a dirt floor, and they were still in it, one of them, 66 years later. Daniel came in 1961, Claudia in 1964, then a long gap, and then Theodore, who was not planned and was called Teddy from the first week and would be called Teddy at 55 in 1971. Here's what the house was like in, say, 1975. Papers on the dining room table, always, 2 stacks, 1 graded and 1 not, held down by a river rock Verna had brought back from Lake Michigan, a red plastic tray from the school's supply closet, the pen lying diagonally across the tray, a coffee cup with a chipped handle, the smell of the mimeograph fluid on the dittos she'd run off at school and brought home, that sharp, sweet chemical smell that every American who was a child before 1985 can still summon instantly and cannot describe to anyone younger. The phone on the wall in the kitchen with the long cord, and the cord stretched around the doorframe because Verna was talking to a parent again at 7:40 at night, and in the front room 3 children. Dan, 14, doing his own homework at the coffee table because the dining room table was not available. Claudia, 11, lying on the rug with her chin on her hands. Teddy, 4, being handed to somebody. They were not neglected children. It is important to be accurate about this, because it would become a point of some contention. They were fed and clothed and read to. There were birthday parties in the backyard, with crepe paper twisted around the porch rail. There were vacations, 3 of them, to a rented cabin on Hamlin Lake. Walt was there, and Walt was steady, and Walt did more of the day in day out than most men of his generation in that town did, and made no announcement about it. But there was a finite amount of a certain kind of attention in that house, and a great deal of it went out the door at 6:40 in the morning and did not come back. Claudia was the one who would eventually put words to it, but that was 50 years later, and words were not what she had at 11. What she had at 11 was a set of facts. Fact, her mother knew without asking, that a boy named Douglas Reifsnyder in her 3rd hour class had gotten a dog. Fact, her mother did not know for about 6 weeks that Claudia had stopped sitting with Bonnie Vanderveer at lunch. Fact, on the 5th of November, 1974, a Tuesday, it rained, and Claudia Kessler sat on the concrete steps outside the north entrance of Renwick Elementary from 3:25 until 5:15, alone, because her mother was supposed to drive her to the orthodontist in Plainwell at 4. What had happened was this. At 3:20 that afternoon, a girl named Sharon Dietz had come back into room 9 to get a coat she had not forgotten, and had stood by the coat hooks not getting it. And Verna Kessler had looked up from her desk and seen the way the girl was standing, and had said, "Sharon, sit down a minute." And Sharon had sat down, and then had not spoken for 11 minutes, and then had spoken. And at 4:05, Verna had put Sharon Dietz in her car and driven her home out on Cold Spring Road, and had gone up the steps of that house and knocked on the door and stood in the doorway talking to a man named Roy Dietz for 25 minutes with the storm door held open in one hand. She got back to school at 5:15. Her daughter was sitting on the steps with her book bag on her knees and her hair flat and dark with rain. Verna said, "Oh, honey. Oh, no. Claudia." Claudia got in the car. Verna apologized. She apologized twice on the way home, and once more at supper. And she called the orthodontist and rescheduled, and the next Saturday she took Claudia to the Kalamazoo Mall and bought her a record she wanted. And none of that was the point, and both of them knew it, and neither of them could have said why. What Claudia remembered was not the rain. It was that when she got in the car, her mother's first sentence, before the apology, before anything, had been, "Sharon Dietz was in a bad spot." 52 years later, in that same house, on a Saturday in April, Claudia Kessler Boyd, 61 years old, hospital administrator, mother of one, would say to her mother, "You told me she was in a bad spot. I was 10, and you told me she was in a bad spot, like I was another adult you could put it down in front of." And her mother would say, "You were the easiest person in my life to put something down in front of. That was my fault, and I did it for 20 years. But that comes later. In 1975, Verna Kessler drove home from work with a stack of papers on the passenger seat and made supper and graded until 11 and got up at 10 to 6 and made coffee in a stovetop percolator and left the house at 6:40 and did it again. She was, by then, becoming extremely good at her job. Let me stop here for a second, because if you've gotten this far, there's a decent chance you're already thinking of someone. Most of us had one, not a whole faculty of them. One adult, somewhere between when we were 6 and when we were 18, who was not related to us and had no particular reason to bother, and who bothered anyway. A teacher, a coach, a librarian, a neighbor, a woman in a church basement who let you help her fold things because she could tell you didn't want to go home yet. And here's the part that gets me. An enormous number of those people died without ever finding out. They went to their graves thinking it was just Tuesday. They thought they were doing their job. So do me a favor. Down in the comments, put the first name of yours, just the first name, Mrs. Kessler, Mr. Alvarez, Coach Bell, whoever it was. And if you've got 20 seconds, put the one small thing they did, not the big speech, the small thing. Those are the ones that stick, and this comment section's going to be full of people who never got thanked, and I think that's worth building. If this story is landing on you, hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And then stay with me, because in about 10 minutes, you're going to meet a man named Curtis Mabry, and Curtis is the one who broke the room. Now, back to Alder Creek. Renwick Elementary held 6th grade until the reorganization of 1979. And then Verna moved with her grade to the new middle school building on Sawyer Road. And then in 1991, the district shuffled again, and she went back to Renwick, which by then had been re-roofed twice and had a computer lab in what used to be the band room. She taught 6th grade reading and English every one of those years. She turned down the department chair position in 1983 and again in 1987. In 1990, the superintendent's office asked her to consider an assistant principalship, and she wrote a 2-sentence reply and never mentioned it at home. The thing she got good at was not lesson planning, though she was good at that too. The thing she got good at was reading a room the way a farmer reads a sky. She could tell in the first 4 minutes of a Monday morning which child had not eaten. She knew which ones had learned to be funny as a defense and which ones were actually funny. She knew that when a child suddenly began doing beautiful work in October, it sometimes meant something wonderful and sometimes meant something terrible, and that you had to find out which. She kept index cards. Every August, before school started, she'd sit at the dining room table with the class lists and write out 1 card per child. And by Halloween, each card had 3 or 4 lines on it in her small upright hand. Older brother in Kuwait. Won't read out loud. Draws. She kept the cards in a green metal file box, and when she retired in 1998, she carried that box home and put it in the hall closet, and it was still there on the shelf above the coats on the afternoon of her 90th birthday, holding just under 1,100 cards. Her family knew about the box the way you know about a thing in a closet. Dan had once, around 2015, suggested she go through some of that. Now, the students. In the fall of 1963, a boy named Odell Grady sat in the back row of room 9 and drew on everything. He drew on the inside cover of his reader. He drew on the brown paper bag his lunch came in. He drew, once, memorably, a very good likeness of the assistant custodian on the back of a spelling test, and the assistant custodian happened to be his uncle, and it caused a certain amount of commotion. Odell was one of 9 black students in that building in 1963 in a town that was not hostile so much as it was thoroughly, comfortably, unexaminedly indifferent, and the general institutional read on him was that he was a nice boy who was not going to be much of a student. His 4th grade teacher had written pleasant, limited on a card that Verna was not supposed to see and saw. What Verna noticed in the 2nd week was that Odell Grady's drawings were not the usual thing. Kids draw objects. Odell drew the space between objects. He drew the gap between the flagpole and the corner of the building and got the gap exactly right. And the flagpole and the building were almost incidental. So, in October, she asked him to make the classroom map. There was no classroom map. She invented the need for one on the spot. She said the room needed a map showing where everything was: the reading corner, the coat hooks, the window ledge with the bean plants for substitutes. And she needed somebody who could see how far apart things were, and she'd noticed he could do that. He said, "That's not a real job." She said, "It is now. I'm not doing it. I can't draw a straight line, and you can see the space between things." He did the map. It took him 11 days, and it was, by the standards of a 12-year-old in 1963, unbelievable. She put it up by the door, and it stayed up for 2 years. And then when she moved rooms, she took it with her. And she still had it, rolled in a mailing tube, in the hall closet, above the coats, next to the green metal file box. Odell Grady graduated high school in 1970, was drafted out of a job at the Ford stamping plant in 1971, spent 2 years in the Army in Germany rather than Vietnam by pure chance, came home, married a woman named Roberta, took the postal exam, and carried mail in Kalamazoo for 31 years. He also, on the side, in a garage, for 4 decades, painted signs. By hand. Gold leaf on glass. The lettering on the front window of the Alder Creek Register that Walt Kessler used to walk past. That was Odell Grady, 1979. Church boards, truck doors, a hardware store in Otsego that still has his work on it, faded now, the R in repairs, ghosting away. He is 74 now, a widower, arthritic in the right hand, and he had not seen Verna Kessler since a grocery store aisle in 1994. In February of 1967, a girl named Ruth Ann Ferris lost her mother. It was fast. A stroke at 41 at the kitchen sink on a Sunday. Ruth Ann was 12 and the oldest of 4. She came back to school after 9 days. In a town like that in 1967, the way these things were handled was that everyone was very kind for about a week, and then everyone very deliberately treated you normally, which was intended as a mercy and functioned, for a 12-year-old, as a kind of exile. Verna Kessler did not sit Ruth Ann down. She did not have a talk with her. She had, in fact, no idea what to say, and knew she had no idea, and had enough sense not to say it anyway. What she did was this. On the Monday, when the lunch bell rang and the room emptied out, she said without looking up from her desk, "Ruth Ann, would you stay and eat in here? I've got a stack of these, and I don't want to eat in the teacher's lounge." Ruth Ann stayed. She sat at the desk in the second row with her sack lunch and did not talk. Mrs. Kessler graded papers. The pen went scritch, scritch, scritch. The radiator knocked. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed, and the noise of the cafeteria came up and went away again. They did that for the rest of the school year. 90-some lunches. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they did not. Sometimes Mrs. Kessler would say something like, "This boy has written 4 pages about a boat, and there is no boat in the story." And Ruth Ann would laugh, and then they'd go back to not talking. Ruth Ann Ferris is 71. She spent 34 years as an intensive care nurse at Bronson in Kalamazoo, most of it on nights, and in those 34 years she sat with a great many people who were dying, and a great many more people who were watching someone die, and she did not, as a rule, say very much to them. She has told approximately 200 nursing students over the years some version of the same sentence. You don't have to talk to them. You have to be in the room, and you have to look like you have somewhere to be, and you're choosing not to go. She has never once, in telling them that, mentioned where she learned it. It didn't occur to her that it came from anywhere. It was just how you did it. In the fall of 1972, a boy named Hollis Trombley could not read. That is an overstatement. Hollis could read. What Hollis could not do was hold his place. His eyes would come to the end of a line and jump, sometimes back to the same line, sometimes down two, and by the third paragraph of anything he'd be reassembling a story out of pieces that didn't fit, and getting it wrong, and getting corrected, and coming to the entirely reasonable conclusion, by age 11, that he was stupid. There was no word for it in Alder Creek in 1972. There was no evaluation, no plan, no specialist. There was a reading group called the Bluebirds, which everyone in the room understood to be the slow group, and Hollis was in it, and had been in it since second grade and would be in it forever. Verna noticed the jump because she watched his finger. He tracked with his finger, which he was not supposed to do, and which everyone had been telling him to stop doing since he was 7, and she noticed that when he lifted the finger, the whole thing fell apart. So she took a piece of manila cardstock, and with a razor blade at her kitchen table on a Tuesday night in October, with Walt reading the paper across from her, she cut a slot in it, just a rectangle, wide enough for one line of type, in the size the 6th grade readers used. The next day she gave it to him. She did not make a presentation of it. She said, "Trombley, try this. It's a thing they use." Nobody used it. She'd invented it 40 minutes earlier. He put it on the page and slid it down, one line at a time, and read 4 paragraphs out loud without a single mistake, and then stopped and sat there. And then he said, "Can I keep it?" He kept it. He is 65 years old, and he has it in his wallet. It's in 3 pieces now, taped, and the tape has gone brown and brittle and been replaced twice, and it does not work as a reading window anymore, and hasn't for 30 years, and it is in the billfold in the back pocket of a retired lieutenant of the Alder Creek Volunteer Fire Department who spent 29 years running into buildings and who, to this day, at any incident of any complexity, writes everything down on index cards, 1 line per card, and hands them out, and has been told by 3 different chiefs that it's an unusual system, and has said every time, "It works for me." In 1969, a girl named Lorene Vickery told Verna Kessler that she was going to quit school at 16 because that was what her sisters had done. She said it flatly, in March, at the pencil sharpener, the way you'd say you were having meatloaf. Verna did not argue. She had learned by 1969 that arguing with an 11-year-old about the shape of her life was like arguing with weather. What she did was lend her a book, a paperback of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, warped at the corner from a leak in the garage. She wrote on the inside cover in blue-black ink, and she wrote 4 words because she had 31 other papers to get through that night. Come tell me after. Lorene Vickery did not quit school at 16. She graduated in 1976, near the bottom of the class, and got married at 19 and divorced at 24. And she has driven a school bus for the Alder Creek District since 1991 and cleanse the county clinic on Sundays, and she has 2 grown sons and 4 grandchildren, and a house with a bad furnace. She never gave the book back. It is 56 years overdue. It is on the shelf in her living room between a bowling trophy and a photograph of her grandson in a football uniform, and she has never once loaned it to anybody, including her own children, because of the 4 words. She also never came and told her after. That was the part she'd been sitting with for half a century. In September of 1980, a girl named Deborah Nowicki did not speak for 6 weeks. Not selectively mute, not diagnosed anything, just that particular kind of shy that looks like sullenness from the outside and is in fact a full-body emergency from the inside. She was small. She had a home perm gone wrong, and her strategy for surviving 6th grade was to be so still that light passed through her. The other teachers used the word sweet, which meant she is not a problem, and therefore she is not a subject. Verna gave her a job. Every morning the attendance slip had to go down to the office. It was a nothing job. Teachers usually sent whoever was closest to the door. She made it Debbie Nowicki's permanently, and she made it official. She said in front of the class, "Deb has the attendance. That's hers." The walk was 90 feet. It required her to hand a piece of paper to Mrs. Pelkey and say the room number. For the first 2 weeks, she whispered it. By November, she said it at normal volume. In January, she came back and reported, unprompted, that the office had run out of the yellow slips and would be using pink ones, and she reported this to the entire class, standing up and sat down looking mildly stunned at herself. Deb Nowicki is Deb Kasperzak now. She is 56. She has been the office manager at the Marsden Grain Elevator on Route 40 for 22 years, and she runs the Alder Creek alumni page on Facebook. She started it in 2009 to organize the 50th reunion for the class of 1959 as a favor to somebody's mother, and never got rid of it. And it now has 1,100 members, and she moderates it every night from a recliner with the television on. She is, by any reasonable measure, the most organized human being in Van Buren County. And she is that way because a woman handed her 90 feet of hallway when she was 11. In November of 1985, a boy named Curtis Mabry was stealing food, not lunch money, food. He'd take a sandwich out of a bag in the coat closet, a bag of chips, an apple. He was clumsy about it, and he got caught in the 2nd week, and by the 4th week, the room had settled into an understanding about Curtis, which was that Curtis was a thief. He was also mean. He was the kid who found the exact thing you were most tender about and said it out loud in front of everyone, and he was good at it, genuinely gifted, and he made 2 different children cry in October. Verna wrote him up twice. The second write-up got him 3 days of in-school suspension in a carol outside the principal's office, and she has never entirely forgiven herself for the second one, because she wrote it on a Thursday, and by the following Monday she had figured it out. What she figured out was that Curtis Mabry ate breakfast on Mondays, only Mondays. He'd come in Monday morning loose and easy and pretty decent company, and by Wednesday he'd be a coiled wire, and by Friday afternoon he was a hand grenade. Then Monday, and he'd be fine again. Somebody was feeding him on Sunday nights. An aunt, it turned out, and the rest of the week his mother was working 2nd shift at a plastics plant in Hartford, and The power had been shut off in the trailer on Bandy Road in October and stayed off until February. So Verna started testing recipes. That was the story. She told the class she was working on something for the church cookbook, and she kept getting the amounts wrong and making too much, and she would bring in a foil-wrapped brick of something on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, banana bread, egg salad, once a whole meatloaf, and she would announce that it was going to spoil, and she needed help. And would anybody stay through the first 10 minutes of lunch and eat some of this so she didn't have to throw it out? She always asked 3 or 4 kids, never just him. That was the whole architecture of it, and she built it in about 4 minutes on a Monday morning, and she maintained it for the rest of the school year, 30-some weeks, at her own expense on a salary of $19,000. Curtis Mabry never once said thank you. He was not a grateful child. He remained, through June, a difficult and frequently unpleasant boy who once told her to her face that her class was pointless. He is 51. He owns Mabry Excavating, which is 4 trucks and 6 employees and a yard out on Cold Spring Road with a chain-link fence around it. Every August since 2011, he calls the district office and asks what the outstanding lunch balance is for the elementary and the middle school, and he pays it, all of it. He has asked them every single year, with some heat, not to put his name on anything, and for 15 years they have complied, and the office staff has a private phrase for it. They call it the August call, and only 2 people in the building know who makes it. In October of 1991, a girl named Esperanza Ibarra arrived in room 9 in the middle of a Tuesday with a folder and no English. Her family were pickers. Southwest Michigan runs on blueberries, and they'd come up from the Rio Grande Valley in June with the crop and would go back down at the end of the season. And Esperanza, who was 11, had been in 5 schools in 2 states in 4 years, and had learned that the correct way to survive a new classroom was to become furniture. She had English, some. She had more than she let on. What she didn't have was any reason to believe she'd be there in 6 weeks, and therefore any reason to invest. The family was going back the 2nd week of December. What Verna did, and she has genuinely never thought of this as a notable thing, and would be baffled to hear it described as one, was write out the rest of the year by hand. Every Friday from mid-October, she took a sheet of school paper and wrote out the coming week's vocabulary and the pages they'd be covering, and in the margin, in blue-black ink, a note. She gave the sheet to Esperanza at the end of the day. And when the family left in December, she asked for an address and got one, a general delivery address in West Laco, Texas, and for the rest of that school year, January through May, 21 weeks, she mailed them chapter summaries, the vocabulary lists, once a paperback, 20-cent stamps out of the drawer at home. Esperanza Ibarra came back to Michigan in June of 1992 with the family and knocked on the door of room 9 on the last half day of school and handed Mrs. Kessler a piece of paper with a book report on it, 7 weeks late, about a book nobody had assigned her. Mrs. Kessler read it standing up, took out her pen, wrote in the margin, and handed it back. Esperanza Ibarra is 46. She is a licensed clinical social worker in Kalamazoo, specializing in school-based services for the children of agricultural workers, and she has a laminated card on her desk, and the card is that piece of paper, or rather a photograph of it, and in the margin, in a small upright hand, it says, "You wrote this for nobody. That's what writers do." She has 11 of the envelopes. Her mother kept them. Her mother, who is now 78 and lives in Bangor, Michigan, and who could not read the letters when they arrived, kept every single one of them in a coffee can, because a teacher in Michigan was writing to her daughter for no reason, and that was not a thing you threw away. There are others. There are a great many others, and most of them will only get a line, which is exactly right, because that's how it works. Most of the important things anyone ever does for anyone else get about a line. Barry Lindstrom, 6th grade 1977-78, who at 11 was accused of taking the field trip money out of the coffee can on Mrs. Kessler's desk, $41 in ones and fives, and who was guilty of nothing except having been the last one in the room. Verna did not defend him and did not lecture anybody about jumping to conclusions. What she did was refuse to send it to the office for 2 days, which bought her 2 days, and on the second evening she got down on the floor of room 9 in a wool skirt with a yardstick and ran it under the file cabinet, and the coffee can money was behind the bottom drawer, where it had gone when the drawer was slammed. She never made a speech about it afterward. She just came in the next morning and put the money on the desk and said, "Found it. My fault. The drawer eats things." Barry Lindstrom is 60, and he is the principal of a high school in Battle Creek with 1,100 students. And he has a rule in that building that nobody's name goes in writing until somebody has physically checked, and he has burned a certain amount of goodwill on that rule over the years, and he has never once bent it. Gil Radke, 6th grade 1961-62, who was drafted in 1968 and spent 13 months near Chu Lai, and who received in that time 4 letters from his 6th grade teacher, because she wrote to every boy from that town whose name went up on the board at the Legion Hall, whether she'd taught him or not, and she taught most of them. He is 76. He lives outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and he drove 5 hours and 40 minutes on the 16th of April with one of those letters in the glove box. Kay Ostrander Tillman, 6th grade 1988-89, hospice aide, 49 years old, who is the daughter of a boy named Bernie, who had shaky handwriting in 1958. Naomi Fetterman Voss, 6th grade 1997-98, Verna's last class, the one that got a retiring teacher who was 62 and tired and, by her own assessment, no longer as good as she'd been at 50. Naomi is 39 and teaches 4th grade at Alder Creek Elementary in a building that replaced Renwick in 2004, and she keeps a green metal file box on the corner of her desk, and she has no idea where she got the idea. And Eldon Pike, born 1947, 79 years old, retired dairy farmer, who sat in the second seat of the first row of room 9 in September of 1958 and watched a 22-year-old woman in a gray jacket write her name on the blackboard and drop the chalk. Verna Kessler retired on June 12, 1998. They had a sheet cake in the library, and the superintendent said some things, and a boy from the 8th grade played Somewhere Over the Rainbow on a trumpet with mixed results. She was given a clock with a plaque on it. She was 62 years old, and she had taught, by the district's count, 1,183 students. She cleaned out room 9 over 2 afternoons. She carried the green file box out to the car herself, and the mailing tube with Odell Grady's map, and a coffee can full of pencils she'd been meaning to sharpen since 1994. And she stood for a minute in the empty room with the desks pushed to one side and the boards washed. And she did not cry. And she went home and made supper. Walt retired the following year. They had 12 good years. They drove to Nova Scotia in 2001. They put in a raised bed for tomatoes, and Walt built a cold frame that never quite worked. He took up birding badly. She took up nothing, which she considered underrated. They went to the Alder Creek 4th of July parade every summer and sat in folding chairs on 3rd Street. And by 2008 or so, people were starting to come up and say, "Mrs. Kessler." And she was starting to have to fake it a little on the names. Walt died on the 4th of March, 2011, in the hallway between the kitchen and the bathroom at 5:20 in the morning of a heart attack. He was 80. She had gone out to plug in the percolator and heard him and came back, and he was already going. They had been married 51 years and 9 months. She kept the house. That was the first argument. It was not much of an argument in 2011. Dan raised it once, gently, in the funeral week way people raise things, and she said she'd think about it, and she thought about it for 15 years. Here is what happened to Verna Kessler's world between 2011 and 2026, and none of it is dramatic, which is the point. Alma Doherty, who taught 4th grade down the hall for 19 years and who was Verna's closest friend, died in 2016. Marge Pelkey, the school secretary, in 2013. Dorothy Vane, from church, in 2019. Ray and Ginny Sowerby, who lived next door for 40 years, sold in 2018 and moved to Arizona. And the house sat empty. And then a family bought it and put up a fence. Renwick Elementary was closed in 2003 and torn down in 2004. Verna drove past it the week they took the roof off, and then did not drive that way again for 11 years. The register folded in 2015. The window Odell Grady lettered went into a dumpster. Dan and Sheila moved to Grand Rapids in 2007. Claudia had been in Charlotte since 1993. Teddy went to Chicago in 1996 and stayed. The grandchildren grew up and became, in the way grandchildren do, extremely nice strangers. Nolan is 34 and works in Detroit and calls on holidays. June is 29 and got married in 2023 in a barn outside Rockford. And Verna went and sat in the 2nd row and had a lovely time and knew 4 people. Simone, Claudia's daughter, is 26 and in a doctoral program in Chapel Hill and sends the occasional text with a photograph of a dog. Marcus, Teddy's boy, is 17 and Verna has seen him 11 times in his life. Christmas got smaller. In 2012, there were 14 people in her dining room. In 2019, there were 9. In 2022, Dan and Sheila drove down for the day. In 2024, she went to Grand Rapids and slept in a guest room with a machine in it that made white noise and could not figure out how to turn it off and lay awake until 2. Phone calls replaced visits, and then texts replaced phone calls. And there is nothing sinister about that. It is just physics. People have jobs. Gas costs money. Everyone is tired. But She was not sitting in the dark. It matters to say that clearly, because there's a version of this where she's a shut-in, and that isn't true. She got up at 10 to 6 every morning of her life and made coffee in a stovetop percolator because she had done it at 10 to 6 for 40 years, and her body was not interested in renegotiating. She read the Kalamazoo paper on her tablet, obituaries first, which she'd started doing at 75 and had stopped apologizing for at 80. She drove a 2011 Buick with 19,000 miles on it to Vedder's on Tuesday and the library on Thursday, 3 miles round trip, daylight only, and she'd imposed that daylight rule on herself in 2021 before anyone else thought to. She had a garden, or the remains of one, 2 tomato plants, and a rhubarb crown that had been there since 1963 and would outlive everyone. She read 4 books a week. Georgianne at the Alder Creek Public Library kept a shelf under the desk with her name on a sticky note. And on Thursdays after the library, she'd get a coffee at the Blue Kettle on 3rd and sit at the 2 top by the window. And about one time in 5, somebody would stop at her table and say, "Mrs. Kessler," and she'd say yes, and they'd tell her a name, and she would 9 times out of 10 pull that name up out of the water, and they would both be pleased with her. That was her life. It was not a wide life. It was a life. The trouble was that from Grand Rapids and from Charlotte and from Chicago, it did not look like a life. It looked like a set of risks. Dan Kessler is 65. He spent 31 years as a claims adjuster and then 8 running a small restoration company. And he retired in 2024. And he is a decent, tired, competent man who solves problems by making a list of them. In September of 2025, he made a document. He did it on a Sunday afternoon, and he did it out of love and worry. And he titled the file Mom, Planning, and it had tabs. The tabs were vehicle, house, medical, finances, timeline. Under vehicle, he had written renewal 6/26. Do we let this happen? Under house, he had written 2400 SQFT, 1 occupant. Roof 2019. Furnace 2013. Stairs. Under timeline, he had written 3 options with dates next to them, and one of the options was Brookvale, Plainwell, 2 BR Avail, waitlist, Raro 14 Mo, put deposit now. He never showed it to her. He showed it to Claudia in October on a video call, and Claudia said it was reasonable and asked about the finances tab, and Teddy was supposed to be on that call and wasn't. None of them were doing anything wrong. That's the thing that makes it hard to be angry in a clean, satisfying way. A 2013 furnace in a 1948 house with a 90-year-old in it is a real thing to worry about. The stairs are real. The car, honestly, is real. But something happens when you start keeping a person in a document. The conversations shift. You stop asking, "What did you do today?" and start asking, "Did you get the blood work?" You stop calling on Sundays because you talked on Tuesday about the gutters, and that counts. You divide the person up. Dan takes house and car. Claudia takes medical because she works in healthcare. Teddy is going through some things. We'll leave Teddy out of it for now. And then, on a Thursday in February, at Dan's kitchen table in Grand Rapids, over a pot roast, someone said 90. Verna was there. Dan had driven down and gotten her and would drive her back that night. Sheila had made the roast. June came with her husband. Claudia was on the iPad propped against the sugar bowl. It was June who said it, actually. She said, "Grandma, you're turning 90 in April. 90!" And Verna said, "So they tell me." And Sheila said, "We have to do something for that." And Dan said, and he would replay this for months, "We'll figure it out. Something at the house, maybe. Or we could do it here." And Claudia, from the iPad, said something about how April was brutal at work, but she'd look at flights. And Teddy, who was not there, and who was texted a photograph of the table by June with the caption "Planning your mom's 90th," replied at 9:41 that night, "Count me in." That was the entire planning process. 9 minutes, 3 people, 1 absentee, and a phrase, "We'll figure it out," that in the Kessler family, as in most families, is not a plan. It is a way of setting a thing down gently on a shelf you are not planning to look at again. Here is how each of them lost the day. Dan had it in his calendar. He genuinely did. Mom 90 entered in 2019 when he set up recurring birthdays. In January of 2026, he switched phones. And in the migration, the recurring events came over, but the alerts didn't. And he did not notice, because you don't notice an alarm that doesn't go off. In the second week of April, his mother-in-law fell in Muskegon and broke her wrist. And Sheila was gone for 9 days. And Dan was driving back and forth and dealing with a claim on a rental property in Wyoming that had a burst pipe. On the 16th of April, he was in a parking lot in Muskegon at 5:40 p.m., eating a gas station sandwich. Claudia had it written down in the planner she keeps on her desk. She had also, in early March, decided privately that she was not going to fly to Michigan for it, that she'd send something good and call, and that if there was a real party in the summer, she'd come for that. She did not announce this decision, because announcing it would have required defending it. On the 15th of April, her hospital went live with a new scheduling system across 4 campuses, and she worked until 10:30 p.m., 4 nights running. She did not look at the planner. The card she'd bought in March was in the drawer of her desk in Charlotte, unwritten, with a stamp already on it. Teddy simply forgot. His divorce was finalized on March 30th. He had lost his job in February and had not told his mother or his brother, only Claudia, and had asked Claudia not to say anything. On April 16th, he was in an apartment in Rogers Park with the blinds down, and he had been having a bad 3 weeks, and it was not the kind of bad that comes with the presence of mind to remember anything. Nolan didn't know the date. June thought Dan was handling it. Simone had a reminder set, but for the wrong month. She'd typed 5/16 in 2024 and had been wishing her great-grandmother a happy birthday 1 month late for 2 years, which Verna found charming and had never corrected. Marcus is 17, and Sheila, who over 38 years had been the one who actually bought the cards and remembered the dates and put Dan's name on things, was in Muskegon, sleeping on a couch next to her mother. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. There's no villain in it anywhere. Every single one of those explanations, taken alone, is a Tuesday. Taken together, they left a woman alone in a house on Peel Street on the 16th of April, 2026, with 4 cups on the table. Now here is the other thing that was happening at the same time, 3 miles away. On the 5th of March, a Thursday, Hollis Trombley went to the Alder Creek Public Library to get a book about the Erie Canal because his grandson had asked him a question he couldn't answer. He came around the end of the biography shelf, and there was Mrs. Kessler at the front desk with her back to him, filling out a card. Hollis Trombley had gone to see her maybe twice a year for the last decade. Tomatoes in August, a shoveled driveway in February, 10 minutes on the porch. Nothing that would count as friendship exactly. He'd been a little afraid of her at 11 and never fully lost it. He said, "Mrs. Kessler." She turned around. Hollis. They talked about the canal, which she knew things about, and about his knee. And while they talked, she was finishing the card, which was the library's own renewal form, because Georgianne had the system down, and the system involved a paper card. And Hollis, who was a large man and was standing close, and was not being nosy, looked down and read, in a small upright hand, Kessler, Verna A. 4/16, 1936. He did the arithmetic in the parking lot. He sat in his truck with the keys in his hand and did it twice, 90, in 6 weeks. He is not a sentimental man, and he did not become one in that parking lot. What he thought was, somebody ought to send her a card. And then he thought, I'll bet nobody does. And that second thought sat wrong with him all the way home. That night he called Deb Kasperzak, whom he had known since she was a mouse of a girl 2 grades behind him, because Deb ran the alumni page and Deb knew where everybody was. He said, "Mrs. Kessler's going to be 90 on April 16th. Deb was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Okay," in a way that Hollis would later describe as the sound of a machine turning on. What Deb did first was small. She put a post on the Alder Creek alumni page on March 7th. It said, "Mrs. Verna Kessler, 6th grade at Renwick, turns 90 on April 16th. If you'd like to send her a card, message me and I'll give you the address. Let's fill her mailbox." That was the whole idea. Cards. The post had 200 comments in 19 hours. Deb has run that page since 2009. She has posted about deaths, reunions, the tearing down of the old water tower, a lost dog, and a fundraiser for a boy with leukemia. Nothing had ever done that. It wasn't the number that got her. It was what they said. They were not saying happy birthday. They were saying things like, "She kept me from getting expelled in 1984 and never told me she did it. Found out from my mother 20 hours later. Mrs. Kessler is the reason I read. She called my dad. I don't know what she said to him, but he came to my graduation. I still have the paper." Deb sat in the recliner with the television on and read comments until 1 in the morning, and then got out of the recliner and went and stood in her kitchen. At 6:15 the next morning she called Ruth Ann Ferris, who she barely knew because Ruth Ann had commented, and Ruth Ann was retired ICU, and Deb had a feeling about her. Ruth Ann listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "Deb, cards are what you send when you can't get there. There's people in Texas on that thread. Then they'll send cards," Ruth Ann said. "The rest of us should go." The idea took 11 days to become a real thing, and it became a real thing the way anything does, which is that 4 people did an unreasonable amount of work. Deb built a spreadsheet, a private one, shared with 9 people, columns, name, years in her class, city, coming or not, bringing what. Ruth Ann handled the ones who were shaky about it, and there were a lot of those. It turns out an enormous number of adults would very much like to thank a teacher, and are also privately convinced that she will not remember them, and that showing up would be embarrassing. Ruth Ann's line, which she used at least 30 times. She'll remember, and if she doesn't, you'll tell her, and then she will. Barry Lindstrom, who runs a building of 1,100 kids and knows how to move a crowd, worked out the logistics. Park on Peel and the 2 side streets. Don't block driveways. Nobody knocks but Hollis. Everybody stays off the porch until the door opens. And Odell Grady, 74, arthritic, made the book. That part came from a comment. Somebody had written, "I still have the paper." And then somebody else wrote me too. And then a woman in Ohio posted a photograph of a mimeographed spelling test from 1977 with a sentence in the margin in blue-black ink, and the thread stopped being a thread and became something else. Deb wrote to everyone who was coming and everyone who wasn't. 1 page. Handwritten, if you can. Tell her the moment you remember. Not a thank you note. The actual moment. What she said, what she wrote, what she did. Mail it to me by April 6th. 63 pages came in from 46 people who were coming and 17 who couldn't. Odell bound them. He had a friend in Kalamazoo with a stitching press, cloth over board, dark green, and on the front in gold leaf by hand, with a right hand that shook and required him to work in 20-minute stretches over 5 days. He lettered 2 words, not her name. He'd thought about her name. He thought about it for a week, and it wasn't right. What he lettered was the margins, and on the flyleaf, in a plainer hand, he wrote, "You wrote in ours for 40 years. Here's ours back. Of the 46 who said they'd come, 6 didn't. A woman in Fort Wayne had a granddaughter with croup. A man from the class of 1970 got called in on a shift and couldn't trade it. 2 of them, brothers, went to a funeral in Toledo instead. One man's transmission went out on US 31 near Rothbury at 2:15 that afternoon, and he sat on the shoulder and cried for a while, and then called Deb and told her not to hold anything up. And one woman, Sharon Dietz's sister actually, got as far as the corner of Peel and 3rd, sat in her car for 20 minutes, and drove home. She would call 2 weeks later. That is also how these things go. So it was 40. Nobody planned for it to be 40. It was not a target. It was just what was left after the world took its cut, and it happened to be a round number, and Barry Lindstrom counted it twice in the street because he was the kind of man who counts, and Deb wrote it in the spreadsheet at 7:34 that evening with a shaking hand. 40. And here's the part that matters, the part that none of them knew. Every one of those 40 people driving in that afternoon from Wisconsin and Indiana and Ohio and Grand Rapids and Battle Creek and Bangor and 3 houses down believed they were crashing a family party. That was the working assumption. Deb had said it explicitly in the group message on Tuesday. Reminder, 6 p.m. Her family will likely be there. Be respectful. Don't overwhelm. We are guests. If they've got something going, we say our piece and we clear out. Ruth Ann Ferris had brought a foil pan of green bean casserole, specifically because she assumed she was contributing to a table that already had food on it. They thought they were the extra. The morning of the 16th of April, 2026, Verna Kessler woke up at 5:38, 12 minutes before the alarm she hadn't needed since 1958. She lay there. The furnace came on. Outside it was still dark, and there was rain starting on the window in that fine, spitting way. 90, she thought. Then she thought about her mother, who died at 66, and her father, who died at 71, and Alma Docherty and Walt. And she did the thing you do at 90, which is a kind of roll call. And then she got up, because lying there was not going to improve. She made coffee in the percolator. She stood at the counter while it went, listening to it start to knock, and then to hiss. And the smell filled the kitchen. And there is no smell on this earth more specific to a certain generation of American mornings than a stovetop percolator getting going in a dark kitchen at 10 to 6. At 7:20, she got a text. Her heart went up. It was the pharmacy. Her prescription was ready for pickup. At 8:05, an email from the credit union. Happy birthday, Verna. Enjoy your special day with a special rate on a personal loan. She read it all the way through, which she would not have admitted to anybody. At 9:30, she drove to Vedder's. She wore her raincoat and her good shoes. In the bakery aisle, she looked at the sheet cakes and then bought the 6-inch white, and she asked the girl not to write on it twice. At the register, she picked up a 0 candle from a boxed set and a 9 from a torn packet and paid $4.11 for candles. She was aware she might be lighting alone. Barb Vetter, who was 70 and whose mother Verna taught with, said, "Somebody's got a birthday." Verna said, "Somebody does." "Well, happy birthday to whoever," Barb said, scanning, not looking up, and Verna said, "Thank you," and did not correct her, and drove home. At 11 Krar, she made the chicken salad, good celery, the grapes for Teddy, walnuts, on the assumption that if anybody came, they'd come at supper time and would probably not want a whole meal. At 12:15, she ate a piece of toast, standing up. At 1, she put the cake on the table. At 1:40, the rain stopped, and the sun came out for 11 minutes, and she went out on the back step and looked at the rhubarb, which was up, red and knuckled and ridiculous, the way it had been every April since Eisenhower. At 2:30, she got out the green tablecloth and ironed it on the board in the back bedroom, which took her a while, and she was aware that ironing a tablecloth for 4 people was a slightly absurd use of an afternoon, and she did it anyway, because her mother had ironed tablecloths, and because it was something to do with her hands. At 3:10, she went to the hall closet for the good napkins, and stood there with the door open, looking at the shelf above the coats, the green metal file box, the mailing tube with Odell Grady's map in it, a shoebox of photographs, Walt's fishing hat. She shut the door without taking the napkins. At 3:45, she changed into the navy dress. At 3:52, she pinned on the wren. At 4, she plugged in the percolator. At 4:30, she checked the phone. At 4:52, a car came down Peel Street and slowed, and she stood up, and it turned into the Nussbaums. At 5:15, she put the chicken salad back in the refrigerator because it had been out too long, and she stood with the door open longer than she needed to. At 5:40, the cake was still whole, and the coffee was cold, and she was sitting in the chair by the window with her hands in her lap, and she was doing arithmetic she did not want to be doing, which went, Dan is an hour and 40 minutes away, if he left at 4, if he left at 5, even. At 5:52, she cut herself a slice, and ate half of it, standing at the counter, and threw the rest away, and washed the saucer, and put it back on the table with the other three. At 6:03, Vetters told her about her rewards points. At 6:12, Hollis Trombley knocked on her door. "We heard you were turning 90, he said. Verna stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame. The wind came up the steps. Down at the curb, a car door shut, and then another. "Hollis," she said, "how many people are out here?" 40, he said. "Give or take. Barry's counting." 40, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked past him again, and this time she started doing what she had done every September of her working life, which was go down a row of faces and find the names. The woman in the red coat with the foil pan, round face, a gap in the front teeth she'd had at 11 and had never fixed. "Ruth Ann," Verna said. "Ferris." Ruth Ann Ferris put a hand over her mouth and said, through it, "Oh, you're kidding me. You had a green lunchbox with a horse on it." Ruth Ann sat down on the second step, just sat down, right there, on the cold concrete with the casserole in her lap, and laughed and wiped her face with the back of her wrist the way nurses do. And then it all came apart in the good way. They came up the walk, not in a line, in that clumsy, apologizing, everybody first, know you first way that Americans do at a door. Somebody said, "Watch the step." Somebody said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Where do you want the beans?" A tall man in a gray overcoat came up, carrying something long and flat, wrapped in a bedsheet, and held it awkwardly out to the side so it wouldn't bump her. "Mrs. Kessler," he said. She looked up at him. He was 74, and he had a white mustache and a cane hooked over his forearm, and she had last seen him in an aisle at a grocery store in 1994. "Odell," she said. You could see the space between things. Odell Grady's chin went. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "Where do you want me to put this?" "What is it?" "Later," he said. It took 11 minutes to get everyone off the lawn and into the house, and it did not go smoothly, and that was the best part of it. Her front hall was 4 feet wide. There were 40 people trying to use it. Coats came off, and there was nowhere to put them. So Deb Kasperzak, who had walked in, looked around, and immediately started running the place, because that is what she does, laid them over the banister in the stairwell, until the banister looked like a rummage sale. Shoes came off by the door, and then somebody said, "Don't take your shoes off. We'll be tracking in and out," and half of them put them back on, and the other half didn't, and there was a pile of shoes by the door for the rest of the night that nobody ever sorted out. The dining room table with the ironed green tablecloth and the 4 cups and the small white cake in the middle of it was, within 4 minutes, invisible. Foil pans, a ham, 2 crock pots, which required Hollis to go out to his truck for a power strip, a tray of those little sandwiches, 3 pies, a grocery store veggie platter that nobody would touch and everybody would comment on. Somebody found the folding chairs in the basement. Verna had 4 from 1988. Somebody else went out and brought lawn chairs in from a trunk. People sat on the stairs. 2 men in their 60s stood in the kitchen doorway for the entire evening because there was nowhere else, and neither of them minded. The house had 13 light fixtures. By 6:40, every single one was on. And Verna Kessler stood in the middle of her own front room and could not sit down, because every time she started to, somebody else came in the door. Mrs. Kessler, a woman in her 50s, small, silver-framed glasses, holding a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. You probably don't. I was Debbie Nowicki. You took the attendance, Verna said. Deb Kasperzak stopped moving. Every morning, Verna said. You wouldn't say the room number for the first 2 weeks. Then you did. 9, Deb said. Room 9. That's right. Deb went into the kitchen and stood by the sink with her back to everybody for about 40 seconds, and then came out and reorganized the entire buffet. They kept arriving. A man named Terence Bow, who had been in her 1969 class and now repaired pipe organs, which delighted her. 2 sisters, Peg and Lois Amsler, class of 82 and 84, who had driven from Fort Wayne together and had argued the whole way. A woman named Charmaine Suggs, class of 93, who had brought her own folding chair and a bouquet of grocery store tulips, still in the plastic. A man named Wade Petrucci, class of 76, who had spent 19 years in and out of trouble and 11 years sober, and who stood by the door with his hands in his pockets for a long time before he came in. At 7:20, a Silverado pulled up, and a man in his 50s got out and went around and helped an old man out of the passenger side and got a walker out of the bed, and the 2 of them came up the walk, slowly. Barry Lindstrom, standing on the porch with a clipboard he'd brought because he cannot help himself, watched them come and looked at his list and said quietly, "That's 40. Eldon Pike was 79 years old, and he'd farmed dairy on Cold Spring Road until his knees quit in 2009. He got to the door and stopped and looked at Verna Kessler for a good while. "You dropped the chalk," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "First day, 1958, you wrote your name up on the board, and you dropped the chalk, and it broke, and you said a word. I did not say a word." "You said shoot," Eldon said. "Second row, first seat. I heard you." And Verna Kessler laughed, a real one, loud, from the belly, the first one, in longer than she could account for, and put both hands on that old man's forearms and said, "Eldon Pike, get in the house. You're letting the heat out." By 7:30, there were 40 former students of Room 9, Renwick Elementary, inside a 2-story White House on Peel Street, and the noise coming out of it was the loudest that house had been since June of 1985. At 7:45, Odell Grady came in from the porch with the thing in the bedsheet, and Deb Kasperzak tapped a fork on a glass, and the room went down slowly, the way rooms do, in patches. "Okay," Deb said. "Okay. So, a few of us, Mrs. Kessler, we made you something." Odell set it on the dining room table, on top of the tablecloth, next to the cake, with the 2 mismatched candles that nobody had lit. He pulled the sheet off. It was a book, big, maybe 14 inches tall, bound in dark green cloth over board, thick, 3 inches thick, and on the front, in gold leaf, hand-lettered, 2 words. Nobody said anything. 40 people had gone quiet in a small house, and you could hear the furnace running and a car going by out on 3rd. Here's the thing about a book like that. You already know what's in it, more or less. Pages written by people. What you don't know yet is the size of it. What you don't know is how much of a human life can be sitting inside 3 inches of paper. So, before Verna Kessler opens it, I want to ask you something specific, and I'd really like an answer in the comments. What's the smallest thing a teacher ever did for you that you still remember? Not the big moment, the small one. 4 words in a margin, letting you stay in at lunch, saying your name right, something that took them 90 seconds and has stayed in you for 30 or 40 or 50 years. Put it below, the name and the small thing. And if you're with me this far, hit like and subscribe, because the next part is where it stops being a birthday. Verna put on her reading glasses. She opened the front cover. On the flyleaf, in plain black ink, you wrote in ours for 40 years. Here's ours back. She turned the page. The first page was a photocopy, a sheet of school paper, mimeographed lines, a book report from 1972 with a C+ at the top in red pencil, and below the C+, in the margin, in blue-black ink, in a small upright hand. Hollis, you told me about the lighthouse chapter before I asked. That means you got there on your own. Verna looked at it for a long moment. That's my hand, she said. Yes, ma'am, said Hollis. Where did you get this? I've had it, he said. 54 years. Hollis. She looked up at him. It's a C+. I know what it is, he said. I never got a C+ before that. I got D's. My mother put it on the icebox. He reached into his back pocket and took out his wallet. And out of the wallet, he took a thing in 3 taped pieces, brown and soft as cloth, and held it in his palm. And I've got this, he said. Verna Kessler put a hand out and touched the edge of it with one finger, and did not pick it up. That's just cardboard, she said. Yeah, Hollis said. Well, she turned the page. The second page was handwritten in ballpoint, in a nurse's fast, slanted hand. I ate lunch in your room for 4 months in 1967, and we mostly didn't talk. I do that now for a living. 34 years of nights in the ICU. I sit with people, and I don't say anything, and I make sure they can tell I'm not leaving. I've taught it to about 200 nurses. I never told any of them where I got it. I'm telling you now. Ruth Ann Ferris, 6th grade, 1966, 67. Verna read it twice. Then she said, to the room, in a voice that had gone thin, I didn't teach anybody that. I just didn't want to eat in the lounge. And Ruth Ann Ferris, from over by the piano, said, Mrs. Kessler, the lounge was 40 feet away and had a coffee pot in it. Verna opened her mouth, closed it. You could have eaten in the lounge, Ruth Ann said. You ate at your desk for 4 months, so a kid wouldn't have to eat alone in a cafeteria 9 days after her mother died. I'm 60-something years into knowing that. You can stop arguing with me about it. Somebody in the kitchen was running water. Somebody handed Verna a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, and she took it and held it without drinking it. She turned the page. Mrs. Kessler, I still have the book. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Warped Corner. You wrote 4 words in it. I never gave it back, and I'm not going to. I told you I was quitting at 16 and you didn't argue with me, which I noticed because everybody argued with me. I drive bus 14 for the district now. 25 years next fall. Kids on my bus. When they say something like what I said to you, I don't argue with them either. I just find out what they like, and then I get in the way of them quitting. That's the whole thing I do. Lorene Vickery, 1969. 70. Verna took her glasses off. Is Lorene here? A woman in a Carhartt jacket by the stairs raised her hand about 8 inches, embarrassed. You never came and told me after, Verna said. I know it. Well, Verna put her glasses back on. Tell me now. Before you go home tonight, I want to hear what you thought of it. Lorene Vickery, 67 years old, put her hand over her eyes, and stood there while a man she didn't know patted her twice on the shoulder blade, and then, not knowing what else to do, handed her a paper plate. She turned pages, a page from Peg Amsler about a spelling bee she lost on purpose and got caught doing it. A page from Terence Bow, who had been told in 1970 that he had a good ear and had spent his life inside the guts of organs in church basements. A page from Charmaine Suggs, one sentence long. You pronounced my name right the first time, and nobody else did until I was 26. A page from Wade Petrucci in careful block capitals. That said, I was not a good kid, and I did not get better for a long time. You were the only teacher whose name I could remember when they made us do the inventory and treatment. That is all. I just wanted you to know your name was in there. She read that one, and set the book down on the table, and stood with both hands flat on the cloth for a moment. I need a minute, she said, to nobody, and went into the kitchen and stood at the sink, and Deb Kasperzak, who was in there, turned around and went out and shut the door and stood in front of it like a bouncer 90 seconds. Then Verna came back out. All right, she said. Whose ham is this? It's very good, and I'd like the recipe. It was Gil Radke's ham, and Gil Radke had driven 5 hours and 40 minutes from outside Eau Claire. And when she came to him, he took a folded envelope out of his jacket, soft, with handling, addressed in her hand to a military address in 1969. You wrote me 4 times, he said. True lie. Nobody wrote me 4 times. Gil, I wrote all of them. I know you did, he said. There were 9 of us from this town over there. I've talked to 2 of them about it. She wrote us all. He put the envelope back in his pocket. You know what that means. That means you sat at a table on a Sunday and did that. Over and over. And you never said anything about it at the 4th of July parade in 1997 when I shook your hand and you asked me about my mother. At about 8:15, Curtis Mabry finally spoke. He'd been there the whole time, in the corner by the bookshelf, a heavy man in a canvas work coat with a beard going gray. And he had not gotten in line for the book, and had not gotten food, and had said maybe 9 words in 2 hours. Somebody had been telling a story about the banana bread. Somebody else said, "Oh, she did that in my year too. She was always bringing that stuff in. She said she was testing recipes for the church cookbook." And Curtis Mabry said, from the corner, "There was no cookbook." The room turned. "There was no church cookbook," he said again. I checked. When I was about 30, I got it in my head to check. Called the Methodist Church, asked the lady if they ever put out a cookbook in the 80s. He looked at the carpet. She said no. Nobody said anything. That was 1985, Curtis said. The power was off in our place from October to February. My mom was on seconds at the plastics plant in Hartford. I was stealing food out of coats, and everybody in that room knew it, and everybody in that room had a name for me by Halloween. He looked up, and he looked at Verna, and his jaw was working. You never once said a word to me about it. Not one word. You just started cooking too much food. For 30 weeks, Verna said. Curtis, let me get it out. She stopped. I was a rotten kid to you, he said. I told you your class was pointless. I remember saying it. I remember the day. He rubbed the back of his neck. You know what you said back? You said, probably. And you went on with the lesson. Somebody laughed, one short surprised bark, and cut it off. I've got 4 trucks now, Curtis said. 6 guys. And every August I call the school district and I ask what the lunch balance is, and I pay it, and I've told them 15 years running not to put my name on it. He shrugged, a big, awkward shoulder roll. I never knew why I was so particular about the name part. Then I got in the truck this morning and it hit me. It's because you never put yours on it either. Verna Kessler stood there in her navy dress with the wren on the collar. Curtis, she said, I wrote you up twice. The second one got you 3 days in that carrel outside Pelkey's office, and I knew by the Monday that I was wrong, and I never took it back. Curtis Mabry looked at her for a second. Yeah, he said, you were wrong. I know it. Okay, he said, so we're square. And he went and got a plate of ham. By 8:30 they had lit the candles, the 9 and the 0, which did not match, and 40 people sang in a small crowded house, badly, in about 3 keys, and Eldon Pike sang the descant part deliberately wrong, because he had been doing that since 1958. She blew them out on the second try. Esperanza Ibarra had been waiting all evening because she'd decided in the car in Kalamazoo that she was going to go last, and she nearly didn't do it at all. She came over at about 8:45 with a coffee can in her hands, not the one wrapped in foil. Hollis's coffee can turned out to be full of tomato seeds, saved from his garden, which was its own conversation. This one was a Folgers can, old, the red, gone pink. Mrs. Kessler, I'm Esperanza Ibarra. I was in your class in 1991, in the fall, only until December. Where's Laco? Verna said. General delivery. Esperanza Ibarra, LCSW, 46 years old, who had spent 20 years being unshakable in rooms where children said terrible things, made a sound and put the coffee can down on the table because she couldn't hold it. You remember the address? I wrote it enough times. My mother kept them. Esperanza got the lid off. Inside were envelopes, 11 of them, canceled 20-cent stamps, the paper gone the color of weak tea. She couldn't read them. She kept every one. She's 78. She lives in Bangor now. She wanted to come and her hip won't let her. And she told me to tell you. She stopped and started over. She told me to tell you that she knew what it meant that somebody in Michigan was writing to her daughter for no reason. Verna picked up one of the envelopes. Her own handwriting, 44 years younger, the letters standing up straighter than they do now. It wasn't for no reason, she said. You were going to lose the whole year. You were smart, and you were going to lose the whole year because of a crop schedule, and that made me. She stopped. Her mouth had gone unsteady. That made me very angry, and I couldn't do anything about the crop schedule. You did the 20 cents, Esperanza said. 20 cents is not 21 weeks, Esperanza said. I counted them when I was 12, and I counted them again last month. Verna Kessler had been standing for 2.5 hours. Somebody noticed and brought her a chair, the good one from the bedroom, carried in over people's heads. And she sat down in it in the middle of her own front room. And she said to the room, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do with all of this. And Barry Lindstrom said, well, funny you should ask. But that came a little later, and before it came, there was Kay. Kay Ostrander Tillman was 49 and worked for a hospice agency out of Paw Paw, and she had been circling the room all night, like a woman working up to a dive. She came over with a page in her hand. Not from the book, a separate page. "Mrs. Kessler, I'm Kay. Kay Tillman. I was Kay Ostrander. I had you in 88, 89. You wrote a paper about a horse that didn't exist," Verna said. Kay laughed wetly. "Oh my God. Yes, I did. You wrote very well about a horse you did not have. I'm Bernie's daughter." The room did not go quiet because the room didn't know. 40 people went on talking. Somebody was laughing in the kitchen. A chair scraped. Verna Kessler sat very still. "Bernard Ostrander," she said. "Yeah, your father was in my first class, 1958. He was. I kept him in from recess for 5 days over his penmanship," Verna said, and her voice was flat and careful. "His hands shook, and I thought he wasn't trying. Somebody told me the family had had a bad summer, and I never asked what that meant, and I never apologized to that child. Not once. Not ever." She looked at her hands. "He's on my list, your father. I have a list. It's short. He's on it." Kay Ostrander Tillman sat down on the arm of the couch. "He hated 6th grade, she said. "I want to be straight with you. He talked about that year like it was a jail sentence. Yes. He also drove me here." Verna looked up. 1989. February. I was failing everything. I was 11. I was mouthing off at school. And my dad got in the truck and drove me to a house on Peel Street on a Saturday morning. Kay's chin was going. "This house." He stood on that porch and he said, "Mrs. Kessler, this is my daughter. She's got a mouth on her and she's smart, and I don't know what to do with her." "I remember," Verna said. "I gave you a puzzle out of the paper. You gave me the cryptogram out of the Kalamazoo Gazette. And you told me if I finished it, you'd give me a harder one." "Kay?" "He hated 6th grade," Kay said. "And when he needed somebody, he drove to you. He was mad at you his whole life, and he still knew where the door was. Both of those are true, and I've had 23 years to decide which one to bring tonight, and I decided I'd bring both because I think you'd rather have both." Verna Kessler put her hand over her mouth. Bernie Ostrander died in 2003 at 56 of a heart attack in a machine shop in Otsego, and his daughter kept the obituary in a drawer and had brought it and did not take it out because she decided in the moment that she didn't need to. "I was hard on him," Verna said, "and I was 22, and that's not an excuse. It's just the fact." "I know," Kay said. "I brought it because you should get to know he came back anyway." Somebody put a plate of pie in Verna's hands. She held it. She didn't eat it. The first the family knew of any of it was at 8:04 p.m. when Perry Nussbaum, who is 78 and lives across the street and has Dan's number from the time the pipe froze in 2018, called Dan Kessler. Dan was in a parking lot in Muskegon eating a gas station sandwich. "Dan, it's Perry, across from your mom. Everything all right over here?" "What do you mean?" "Well, I count 30-some cars on the street. Both sides. Somebody's parked in front of the Dietrich place. House is all lit up." A pause. "I didn't want to walk over if it's family." Dan Kessler sat in his truck with the sandwich in his hand. "What's the date, Perry?" "It's the 16th. There is a specific physical sensation that goes with a certain kind of realization, and everyone who has ever had it recognizes the description. It starts at the sternum and goes down. "Perry," Dan said, "I have to call you back." He called Claudia. It went to voicemail. She was on a conference bridge in Charlotte at 8:06 p.m. on the 15th day of a go-live. He called Teddy. It rang 11 times. He did not call his mother. He would think about that for a long time afterward, that his first instinct was to call his siblings, to establish the shape of the failure, to get his arms around the problem, and that he sat in a parking lot in Muskegon for 19 minutes doing project management on his own mother's 90th birthday before it occurred to him to simply call her and say happy birthday. By the time it did occur to him, it was 8:31, and he thought, "She's got people there I'll be interrupting," which was true and was also the most convenient thing he could possibly have thought. He texted instead, "Mom, I am so sorry. I don't have words. Calling you tomorrow morning." Verna's phone was in the kitchen under a stack of napkins. She saw it at 10 o'clock. Claudia found out at 6:50 the next morning, Friday, from her daughter. Simone Boyd, 26, in a graduate apartment in Chapel Hill, had opened Facebook because she couldn't sleep, and the algorithm, which does not care about anything, had put in front of her a post from a group called Alder Creek Alumni, shared by a woman she'd never heard of named Deb Kasperzak. It was a photograph taken on the front lawn at dusk. 40 people, badly arranged, several of them blurred because they were still moving. An old woman in a navy dress in the middle, sitting in a kitchen chair somebody had carried outside for her, holding a big green book on her knees. The caption said, "Mrs. Verna Kessler, 6th grade, Renwick Elementary, 1958-1998. 90 years old today, 40 of us made it. She named 31 of us without being told." Simone read it 4 times. Then she called her mother. "Mom, was great-grandma's birthday yesterday?" There was a silence on the line long enough that Simone said, "Mom." Claudia Kessler Boyd was standing in her kitchen in Charlotte in a bathrobe, and she had the planner open on the counter in front of her, the one she keeps on her desk and had not looked at in 9 days. And on the square for April 16th, in her own handwriting, it said, "Mom, 90. Send me the picture," she said. Teddy found out at 11 on Friday morning when he finally listened to his brother's voicemail, and he sat down on the floor of an apartment in Rogers Park with the blinds down and stayed there for a while. The last car left Peel Street at 9:40 on Thursday night. Deb Kasperzak washed dishes for 40 minutes and would not be argued with. Barry Lindstrom carried the folding chairs back down to the basement and put them exactly where he found them. Hollis Trombley took 2 bags of trash out to the can and then came back in and stood there rubbing his hands on his jeans. "Mrs. Kessler," he said, "is somebody coming? Tonight, I mean, your kids." "They're all over the place," Verna said. "Grand Rapids, Charlotte, Chicago." Hollis looked at her. "Hollis," she said, "go home. Thank you for the tomato seeds." When they were gone, she stood in the front room. There were 41 used cups. There were flowers in 3 vases, and 1 water pitcher, and 1 empty mayonnaise jar. There was a chair from the bedroom in the middle of the room facing the wrong way. There were 2 foil pans of food she would never finish, and a ham she'd be eating for 11 days. There was a photograph somebody had left on the piano, a Renwick class picture from 1974 with a strip of masking tape on the back and names in ballpoint. The green tablecloth had a coffee ring on it. The cake had 4 slices out of it and 2 burnt-down candles lying next to it on a napkin, a 9 and a 0, one darker blue than the other. And on the table, taking up most of it, the book. She sat down at the table at 10:15 at night, 90 years and about 18 hours old, and she picked up her phone and read her son's text. Then she put the phone down, face up, and did not answer it, and opened the book at the beginning and started to read it properly. She got through 11 pages before she had to stop. Dan drove down Friday afternoon. He brought a card he'd bought at a Meijer in Muskegon that morning and hated the moment he was in the driveway. He came in and saw the house, the cups still on the drain board, the flowers, the chairs not put back, that giant green book on the dining room table where the mail usually was, and something in his face did a complicated thing. Mom. Hello, Daniel. He said the whole speech, the phone migration and the alerts, Sheila's mother's wrist, the burst pipe in Wyoming. He said it all in about 90 seconds, competently, the way he'd have laid out a claim, and then he ran out of it and stood there in her kitchen with his car keys in his hand. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, Verna said. No, don't. Because it isn't, and if I tell you it is, you'll believe me, and then it'll be filed. Dan set the keys down. I don't need a party, she said. I want to be very plain, because I've had all night to get plain. I didn't want a party. 4 cups. I put out 4 cups. She smoothed the tablecloth by her hand. I wanted somebody to know what day it was. Dan Kessler, 65 years old, stood in his mother's kitchen and cried, which he had done twice in his adult life, and Verna let him do it, and did not get up, and did not comfort him, which cost her something. Then she said, Sit down. There's about 9 pounds of ham. He sat. She made coffee, and after a while she said, Now, tell me about this document. What document? The one with the tabs. Dan went a shade paler. Claudia told you. June told me. In February. She thought I already knew. Verna put the cups down. Brookvale. Plainwell. 14-month wait list. Mom, I want to say something, and then I want you to say something, and then we'll eat. She sat. You were not wrong about the furnace. It's 13 years old, and it's going to go, probably in January, probably at 2 in the morning. You were not wrong about the stairs, and in about a year and a half, you're going to be right about the car. And I'd like to be the one who says it first. So put that in your tabs. Dan didn't say anything. Here's the part you were wrong about, she said. You were making a plan for a person who had finished, and I hadn't. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. There were 40 people in this house last night, Daniel. You knew about maybe 2 of them, not because you're a bad son, because you stopped asking me what I did on Thursdays about 6 years ago. Mom, that's not... It might not be fair, she said. It's still true. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, Who was here? Sit there, she said, and I'll tell you who was here. It took 2 hours. She got out the green metal file box from the shelf above the coats and she read him index cards, and by the end of it, Dan Kessler knew that a man named Curtis Maubrey pays off the school lunch debt in August, and he sat with that for a while. Claudia came the following weekend, April 25th, a Saturday. She flew into Grand Rapids and rented a car and drove down alone, which was a decision. She brought a cake, a good one, from a bakery, Spice, because she had actually thought about it, and she set it on the counter and looked at the room and said, "So, this all happened here." It did. Simone showed me the picture. Claudia took her coat off and didn't hang it up, just held it. 31 names, Mom. Out of 40, without being told. 31 out of 40 is not what it used to be. Mom, I missed 9 of them. Claudia laughed, and the laugh came out wrong, cracked in the middle, and she said, "Do you hear yourself? That's—" And then she stopped and set the coat down on a chair, and it came out of her the way things do when they've been under pressure for 52 years. I sat on those steps for 2 hours. Verna's face did not change much. November 5th, 1974. Claudia stared at her. "It was raining," Verna said. "You had the orthodontist in Plainwell at 4. You remember the date. I remember every part of it. You never," Claudia's voice went, "you never once acted like it was a big thing. You bought me a record." "I know. I was 10 years old and I sat in the rain, and when you finally came, you got in the car and the first thing out of your mouth was that Sharon Dietz was in a bad spot." Claudia was crying now and furious about it. Sharon Dietz was in a bad spot, like I was a colleague, like we were 2 adults comparing caseloads. I was 10. Verna Kessler sat down slowly at her own kitchen table. "You were the easiest person in my life to put something down in front of," she said. "You were smart, and you were steady, and you never made a fuss. And I used that. For about 20 years I used it, because everything else in that house wanted something from me, and you didn't seem to." She folded her hands. "That was a failure of attention, which is a strange thing for me to have been guilty of, given what I did for a living, and I've known it for a long time, and I never said it out loud, because saying it out loud makes it real, and then I'd have to carry it." Claudia sat down across from her. "I want to say something else," Verna said, "and I want you to let me finish it, because it's got 2 halves, and the first half is going to make you angry." "Fine." "You're right," Verna said, "about all of it. They got a version of me. Those 40 people in this house last night, they got the best hours of my day. They got me at 9 in the morning, rested, patient, with a plan. You 3 got me at 6 at night with a stack of papers. And I told myself for 40 years that was the trade, and that it was a fair one, and it was fair to them." She looked at her daughter. "It wasn't fair to you, and you didn't get a vote." Claudia was very still. "That's the first half," Verna said. "Here's the second." "Okay, that was 52 years ago." Her voice stayed level. "And on Thursday, 3 people I raised forgot the day I was born, and I am not going to let it get explained to me. Not with a document, and not with the rain in 1974 either." She turned her hands over. "You can be owed something by me, and still owe me something. Both accounts stay open. That's how it works with families as far as I've ever been able to tell." The refrigerator cycled on. "I'm not going to fix this today," Claudia said. "No. I don't know if I can fix it at all. I've been carrying it since Ford was president, and I don't know who I'd be without it." "That's honest," Verna said. "I'll take honest." Claudia looked at the huge green book on the dining room table. "Can I read it?" "You can read it," Verna said. "You'll want to sit down. There's one about a boy named Wade Petrucci that took the top of my head off." They sat at the table and read it together for 2 hours, and Claudia asked questions, and her mother answered them, and at one point Claudia said, "You never told us any of this," and Verna said, "You never asked me a single thing about my job in 40 years. And Claudia said, "Neither did you about mine." And they both sat there with that. It didn't fix anything. Claudia flew home on Sunday, but she started calling on Tuesdays, not about the furnace. And in June she came again for 4 days without an occasion. Teddy took longer. He called on the 22nd of April at 11 at night, drunk, and apologized for 11 minutes without stopping. And Verna listened to all of it and then said, "Theodore, when did you lose the job?" Silence on the line. "February," he said. "And the divorce is done?" "March 30th. "All right," she said. "That's what I wanted to know. Go to bed. Call me Sunday when you're sober, and we'll talk about what you're going to do." He called on Sunday. He has called most Sundays since. He has not visited yet. As of this telling, he is still in Rogers Park and still looking, and his mother has not stopped asking, and that is where that one stands, which is honest. Barry Lindstrom's idea arrived in a manila envelope on the 1st of May. He'd floated it at the party at about 9 o'clock, standing by the bookshelf with a paper plate. That a number of them had been talking, and that a bunch of people who'd driven 4 hours to stand on a lawn probably had more in them than a lawn. And would she be willing to hear a proposal? The proposal was 2 pages, and it was small, on purpose. 22 of the 40, plus 9 of the ones who couldn't come, would each put in whatever they could. Some of them $40 a year, one of them considerably more. Curtis Mabry's line just said, "Whatever's short, call me." And the money would do exactly 2 things. It would buy books, and it would pay mileage for volunteers. The volunteers were the point. Retired people. 20 minutes a week, 1 kid, in the library at Alder Creek Elementary and the middle school on Sawyer Road. Not tutoring, exactly. Barry had written it carefully. Adults who will notice one specific child and say what they noticed out loud. Every volunteer would write 1 card a week, 1 sentence, something they actually observed. Not good job. They wanted to call it the Kessler program. Verna said no. She said it on the phone on a Tuesday, and she said it in about 4 seconds. And Barry Lindstrom, who runs a building of 1,100 and is not used to being told no that fast, said, "Can I ask why?" "Because in 9 years nobody will know who Kessler was," she said, "and it'll just be a word on a form. And because it isn't mine. I got it from somebody." "From who?" "Her name was Ada Lindqvist. She taught 7th grade English in Fremont, Michigan, and she died in 1971, and there's nobody left who remembers her, and she is the reason I did any of it." A pause. "Name it after her, and when a kid asks who that was, somebody will have to find out and tell them." So there is now in Van Buren County, Michigan, a small volunteer program in 2 school buildings called the Lindqvist Hour, and there are people in that county who assume it's named after a donor. It started in September of 2026 with 9 volunteers and 11 kids. By January, there were 14 volunteers. Ruth Ann Ferris does 2 mornings. Odell Grady, who cannot hold a brush steady anymore, for Gold Leaf, sits with a 4th grader named Marcus Deal on Tuesdays and lets him draw. Lorene Vickery does hers on her split shift, in the bus with the engine off, which is against about 3 policies, and which Barry Lindstrom has decided he did not hear about. Verna Kessler is on the advisory committee, which meets 4 times a year, and she has voted against 2 things. She did not go back to work. She's 90. Her hip is what it is. She can do about 40 minutes on her feet, and then she needs to sit, and on damp days, it's less. What she does is this. On the 2nd Thursday of the month, if the weather's decent and it's daylight, she drives the 2011 Buick 3 miles to Alder Creek Elementary. She still drives, daylight only. And in September of 2027, she'll be the one to say when that stops. And she has already told Dan so, and he has already, to his credit, written it down and closed the tab. And she sits in a chair in Naomi Fetterman Voss's 4th grade classroom for an hour. Naomi was in her last class in 1997. Naomi keeps a green metal file box on the corner of her desk and now knows exactly where the idea came from. Some months Verna reads them a page out of the big green book with the names taken out. The kids love the one about the boy who couldn't hold his place on the line, and the piece of cardboard with the slot cut in it. They ask her to do that one over and over. In November, a girl named Yesenia asked if she could make one. And now there are 9 of them in that classroom, cut by the kids themselves. And Naomi has stopped explaining them to visiting administrators. Other things happened, and not all of them are triumphs. Gil Rodke died in February of 2027 in Eau Claire at 77. Verna found out from Deb, who found out from the alumni page. She sat with the obituary on her tablet for a long while at 10 to 6 in the morning with the percolator going. 90-year-olds keep losing people. That does not stop because 40 of them came to your door once. Wade Petrucci lost his job in the fall and had a hard winter and is, as far as anyone knows, all right. Eldon Pike is 80 and moved in with his son in November. Deb Kasperzak still runs the alumni page from a recliner with the television on. She started a thread in September called "Where's Your Paper?" and there are now 240 photographs on it, mimeographed spelling tests, book reports, the fly leaves of paperbacks, all of them with a line in the margin in blue-black ink in a small upright hand. Some of them are from teachers other than Verna. That was not planned, and Deb says it's her favorite part. The house on Peel Street is still the house on Peel Street. The furnace went out on the 9th of January 2027 at about 4 in the morning, exactly as Dan predicted, and she called him and he drove down in the dark and sat with her in the kitchen in Coates until the man from Van de Waal Heating came at 7. He did not say, "I told you, that's not nothing." There is a photograph on the piano now, the one Deb posted, printed and framed, 40 people, badly arranged, on a lawn at dusk. Verna looks at it about as often as she looks at her wedding picture, which is to say not often, which is to say she knows exactly where it is. And the big green book stays on the dining room table, not in a drawer, not in the closet above the coats with the file box and Odell Grady's map, on the table where the mail used to go so that anybody who comes in has to move it to sit down. That was a decision she made in May, and she made it out loud to Claudia on the phone. She said, "If I put it away, it becomes a thing that happened to me. If it's on the table, people read it." Here's the part I keep coming back to. There is almost certainly a person out there who did something for you that they have completely forgotten. 90 seconds on some Tuesday of their life. A sentence, a ride, letting you sit somewhere. And there is a decent chance that person is still alive and is sitting in a quiet room right now, doing the arithmetic that people do at a certain age, wondering whether any of it landed anywhere. They don't know. That's the thing. They almost never know. So do this, if you would. Put the first name in the comments, just the first name of that teacher, and the one small thing, not the speech, the small thing. Somebody scrolling past is going to read yours and go find their own person while there's still time. And that is a use of a comment section I can get behind. Like the video if it moved you, subscribe if you want more of these, and then go call them if they're there to call. Verna Kessler still gets up at 10 to 6. On a Thursday morning in October of 2027, 91 years old, she made coffee in the percolator in the dark and listened to it knock and then hiss. And at 9 she got in the Buick and drove 3 miles to Alder Creek Elementary and sat in a chair in Naomi's classroom for an hour. There's a boy in that class named Denny Hobart, 9 years old. He does not talk. Not a diagnosis, as far as anyone can tell. He just doesn't. And by October, the room has quietly organized itself around not needing him to. That morning, a wren got into the coat room through the propped door and made a commotion, and 11 children and 1 teacher spent 4 minutes trying to get it out, and it went out on its own the way they do. And Verna Kessler, sitting in a chair by the window with her hands in her lap, saw Denny Hobart watching the empty doorway for a good while after everybody else had gone back to their desks. She asked Naomi for a card. She took the pen out of her purse. Green marbled celluloid, hairline cracked down the barrel, the cap band worn so smooth you can only find the AL if you know where to put your thumb. 69 years old, that pen, and it skips now unless you go slow. She went slow, scritch, scritch, scritch. Then she capped it and got up in the way she gets up now, with a hand on the sill, and walked over and put the card face down on the corner of a 9-year-old's desk without saying anything about it, and went back and sat down. It said, "Denny, you were the only one still watching after it left."